I'm Brian Fowler, president of Blind Creek Resources Limited, listed on the TSX Venture Exchange, ticker symbol BCK. Blind Creek is focused in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. The company's key property is the Blend Project, one of the largest undeveloped lead-zinc-silver deposits in Western Canada, plus plans to advance the recently acquired, fully permitted historic engineer gold mine in the Atlan District of Northwestern BC. Check us out at blindcreekresources.com.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Hilliard MacBeth, author of the book When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. He's also a portfolio and financial advisor in Edmonton. Welcome back to the show, Hilliard.
Nice to be back.
One of the questions we've just received here is the mortgage lending market tightening up?
I think that undoubtedly it is, and it's a combination of a bunch of things. There's been some interest rate increases. Now, they're small. They're 20 basis points, 30 basis points at a time. There was another round that was just put through this morning. However, cumulatively, it makes quite a difference. And, I was looking back at some of the numbers that I crunched in my research, and at 6.5%, we're still a ways away from there, but, the trend is going in that direction. People pay as much interest on the loan as they do on the amount borrowed. So if somebody buys a $600,000 house and borrows $500,000, by the time they've paid back the loan over 25 years at 6.5%, they paid double the loan. So the loan is $500, the interest is $500. They paid $1 million. So they basically end up paying $1.1 million for a $600,000 house, and that's the effect of the pure interest rate increase. But there's other tightening measures as well, which is things like home capital getting into trouble, which means you don't have that mortgage finance company that you can go to that maybe is a little bit more flexible than a bank would be. Things like all the new rules for CMHC, the new stress test rules which apply to the insured mortgages, and have been proposed to be applied to uninsured mortgages. So if they are brought out to go to uninsured mortgages, that's going to be a huge tightening. And then the stress test. So everybody knows about the stress tests where they have to qualify at 2% higher than the current level. So if the current 5-year rate is 4.5%, people are required to qualify at 6.5%. And there's a lot of pushback from the mortgage industry because some of these rules that I've just ran through quickly are already in place, and some of them are proposed. And the mortgage industry is saying if all of the proposed rules go through, especially that stress test on the uninsured mortgages, it's going to be a major tightening of the mortgage market. And of course, for the person who hasn't bought a house yet, it's a good thing because that'll bring house prices down. But for the mortgage industry, it's obviously going to lower their volumes dramatically.
We've just received news that Canadian housing starts are at a pace we haven't seen since the 70s. Annualized, the July starts would amount to 222,000 plus homes being built. Now, I imagine that rate would slow down in November and December, yet that is a pretty high building rate. Is that too much, or is that going to meet the demand in hot markets, especially in Vancouver and Toronto?
If you looked at the demographics and the growth and the population and that sort of thing, it would be way too much. And it's been like that for many, many years now. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, Canada's been averaging 200 or higher for most years. And, of course, this 220 is a new high, but not that long ago we had a recent high of 218 or something like that. So we just keep hitting higher. Now, some of that, whereas it doesn't distinguish between, in that total, some of it's single-family homes, some of it's condos for sale, but a lot of it in the recent days have been, the recent months have been purpose-built rentals. So there's quite a huge surge in people building apartment buildings to be rented out. And so the speculators don't come into that in terms of the purpose-built rentals, but the speculators are certainly buying multiple condos. Edmonton, where I live, I've heard stories of people buying 5 and 10 condos. That a new building goes up, they'll say, okay, I'll take 5, I'll take 10. So that inflates the demand for housing. And I understand in Vancouver they're marketing in Hong Kong and China, and people might order multiple numbers of condos on those sales. So that isn't the same as demographic demand, population growth demand. That's speculative demand. But if you took away all that speculative demand, if you could, or for some reason it evaporated, then this current pace would be way too high for the demographics and the population growth.
Is there any resentment towards these refugees pouring in from the U.S. to Canada from Haiti? They estimate something like 12,000 or so now annually. They're getting housing sponsored by the federal government. What about Canadians who can't get homes?
Well, it's probably some people in the housing market that are grateful that they, with the slump now happening in Toronto, the influx of people coming in. Now, I imagine they're probably mostly going into Quebec and Montreal, but maybe it's something that would save the housing market in Canada from. But people that come with refugee status, obviously, they usually don't bring a lot of money or any money with them. So it's not a good source of demand for expensive housing like the kind that we have in Canada.
I don't know. I just saw a video of the apartments that the people in Montreal were getting, and the people here on the social housing list in BC, in Toronto, I'm sure are pretty jealous.
It's interesting. I talked to a fellow from Lebanon, and he said in his hometown in Lebanon, when the refugees were originally, this is a while ago, a year or two ago, the refugees coming from the crisis in Syria were coming. Some of them were coming with quite a bit of money, and people were really upset because what the landlords were doing was evicting the local people out of their apartments and charging the refugees double and triple the rent that they were charging the local people when they came in. So I think Lebanon's absorbed something like 1 million refugees from Syria, just an incredible number. And that would have a huge impact on rents, obviously, and it has there. But I don't think the numbers that, we don't know yet how big the numbers are going to get, but I don't think the numbers so far are big enough to make a lot of difference. I know that in parts of Canada, like Alberta, Saskatchewan, especially, the landlords are having trouble finding the tenants because obviously the jobs are not as plentiful as they were. And so they're desperately looking for tenants, and rents are dropping. And then some of the rents have had to drop quite a bit in Alberta. But in other parts of Canada, things are still holding up pretty firm. But the new supply, where we started talking about a minute ago, eventually when all that new supply hits, it's going to really help balance the market and maybe go too far the other way. Although I have heard from people that have seen a lot of the new apartment buildings, the units are very small compared to what they're used to. They're only building, 500 square feet or less, and most people are used to 750 or 800 or even 1,000 square feet for a rental. So there is a problem there. Maybe they're building the wrong kind of housing, but we'll see.
Also in Vancouver, half of Vancouver's residents rent, and Vancouver's always had a shortage of rental property. When I first came to the city in '82, I only found an apartment because I went to the loading dock at the newspaper and at 3:30 in the morning and snapped up a paper there and got one of the 30 apartments that were listed that day.
Yeah, the problem too with renting is people hate paying rent because they feel like they're throwing their money away. And I got into a discussion on Twitter a couple of days ago about a Toronto rental, and this has been a high-end market in Toronto because, like you just said in Vancouver, people in Toronto say there's nothing to rent. Well, what they really mean is there's nothing to rent at the rental price that they would like to pay. But if you go up into and in this case I think it was $4,300 a month, which seems like an enormous amount of rent. But what they were talking about was a $1.7 million home in the Moore Park area of Toronto, the most exclusive, like Kerrisdale kind of in Vancouver. and 4 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, beautiful. On the internet anyway, it looked like a beautiful home. And for $4,300, I was trying to explain to people that's a bargain, because it would cost, something like $100,000 a year or $8,300 a year a month, $8,300 a month to own a home similar to that. So if you can rent it for $4,300, even though $4,300 sounds like a lot of money, it's a bargain. And that's what I found all across Canada, is if once people can open up their minds a bit to paying a little bit more in terms of the monthly rental, there is quite a bit for rent. And the advantage of that is there's no risk if the housing prices come down. The renter doesn't bear any of that risk the landlord bears. So it's a pretty good position to be in.
A long time ago, you used to be able to rent to own. I know when it comes, if you crunch the numbers, it's not a very financially efficient way to do it, but at least eventually you might own that property. Do people still rent to own?
I haven't heard much about it. It used to be quite popular. I think what it is it's something that when the housing market is very cold or cool, the owners of the houses are faced with the necessity to rent, and then they try to induce the tenants to think about buying the place, because there just aren't that many buyers around. So if the downturn in the housing market has started and eventually it becomes a crash, as it looks like it might be in Toronto, we'll start hearing about those stories in maybe a year from now or 2 years from now. But right now, the boom is so recent in people's minds that homeowners are still thinking about, can I flip it for a big profit? They haven't gotten to the point where they're desperate to sell the place to the tenant that's living there. So, but all of those schemes will come back. That's just, we're not at the right part of the cycle for that sort of thing to be going on now.
And I've also heard too that vendor take-back mortgages might be popular again, where the seller is actually the mortgage holder, so they get a down payment, and then you make a monthly payment to them that is slightly less than what you would pay to a bank. So the former homeowner wins, the home buyer wins, and the banks are squeezed out. Do you see those coming back if rates go up?
Absolutely. And I was in Whitefish, Montana a couple of months ago, and I talked to a fellow there, and they still have the aftermath of the global financial crisis, which happened 9 years ago. But they're still feeling that. And he was trying to buy a luxury property, for $1.6 million that had at the peak been worth $3 or $4 million, and he just needed $600,000. And none of the banks and none of the credit unions or any of the lending facilities in Whitefish would lend the money to him, even though he had more than 50% down. So the seller ended up lending him the $600,000 to complete the sale. But the lender was desperate, and he really wanted to make the deal go through. And then the guy paid him back about a year later. I said to him, that was a terrible time, that financial crisis. And he said, no, Hilliard. He said, I'm talking about, this was just a year ago this happened. So I can't believe that sort of thing is still going on, given that the financial crisis was 2008, and here we are 9 years later. But the lending market in the United States is still broken. There's no maybe it's just Whitefish, and if you're in San Francisco, you wouldn't have that problem. But there's still lots and lots of weird things going on in the lending market after the crisis. The aftermath is still carrying on. So we haven't got to that point yet in Canada. We're still, people can still go to the banks and still borrow ridiculous amounts of money and that sort of thing. But at some point, we'll get into all this other stuff, and that's when you get the real bargains. When the banks are lending freely, there's really no bargains to be had. But when the lending market dries up, that's when you get the interesting situations where you can really take advantage. I mean, sounds terrible, but take advantage of a desperate seller who really needs to sell badly, and that's when you get these vendor take-back mortgages and that sort of thing. And for the very few buyers out there that have the money, the down payment to be able to buy, it'll be a great time. But there won't be very many of those people.
We'll have more with Hilliard MacBeth right after the break.
Arctic Star Exploration, operated by a team of proven mine finders, is focused on diamonds in Finland and the Northwest Territories of Canada. A work program is planned for our Finland property that contains diamond-bearing kimberlite. Arctic Star trades on the TSX Venture Exchange, symbol ADD, and the Frankfurt Exchange, symbol 82A1. Please visit our website at arcticstar.ca or call us at 604-689-1799.
I'm Bill McWilliam, President of Cascadero Copper, CCD on the TSX Venture Exchange. Cesium is one of the world's rarest metals with a growing industrial demand. Drilling is underway on our Tehran property in Argentina to prove up a cesium resource. Cascadero's patent-pending leach process has the potential to make Cascadero the lowest cost supplier of cesium in the world. Visit our website, cascadero.com, or phone us at 604-924-5504.
Welcome back. We're chatting with Hilliard MacBeth. Hilliard, the XL Keystone hearings are back on in Nebraska, the last major hurdle to get that pipeline going. Are you optimistic it'll happen, and will that be a big boost for Alberta's economy?
Well, I think it would be very nice for the Alberta economy. Right now, a lot of that, so this Keystone X, they call it the XL, it's actually the fourth stage of the Keystone. So there's been 3 stages of Keystone have already been completed, and they're up and running, and they're doing their thing with the pipeline. But the 4th stage is the bridging. It allows a lot of this Alberta and Saskatchewan oil to get to the main pipeline components in the United States, and unfortunately it goes through Nebraska, and unfortunately it goes through some sand dunes in Nebraska that the local people feel are very important, and they're worried about a oil spill. So
apparently, it does go around the Sandy Hills now.
They've altered it. So, but there's still a lot of opposition. And what the main impact for Alberta would be if they were able to get that through, and we don't know if it will be possible, but is it would save a lot of money on rail car, because the rail car costs $10 to $15 a barrel, and the pipeline costs maybe $5 a barrel. So it's a huge, and we, northern Alberta and all of Canada for that matter has a bit of a price disadvantage because we got to ship it so much further than say Texas. So every dollar matters, especially when oil is down in the $45 to $50 range. Giving up that $10 is a lot to give up, and so if they can make that bridging, so they're getting around it now. So actually the volumes are moving. And there are plants that are just newly coming in. The plants that have been under construction for several years now are just being completed now, and probably the last plant will be finished. I think Fort Hills is the last one. It'll be finished by the end of this year, and that'll be another, something like 200,000 or 300,000 barrels. But and they're able to move that stuff without the Keystone XL. But it sure would be nice because they would save a lot of money. Otherwise, they'll be looking for things like Kinder Morgan to go to the BC coast, and they would have enough volume to move all. Even if the Keystone and the Kinder Morgan were built, they could fill up all of those pipelines. So the one pipeline that's looking like it may not go ahead, some of the other proposals, because they aren't getting enough interest from the shippers. So it seems like the shippers have learned to get around the lack of pipelines using the rail cars. And so rail cars, although they're way more expensive, are a lot more flexible in that you can order, rail cars to ship your product, and then you can cancel it 6 months later. Whereas with a pipeline, the person building the pipeline requires that you commit for the next 20 or 30 years. And it seems like, with the changes in the oil industry now, electric cars coming, perhaps maybe nobody wants to commit for 20 or 30 years. So the Keystone would be a really good component because it's the last piece in a puzzle that's already 3/4 built, and it would help smooth the transition and get rid of some of that expensive rail car stuff. But the other pipelines that have been proposed, they may never go ahead the way things are going.
Well, transporting oil with tanker cars is a lot more dangerous to, though, than pipelines, isn't it?
Well, I think so. I think the fact is in North America, most railways, especially the ones that go through BC, for example, but I think most railways tend to follow the rivers, and so because that was the place where it was easy to find a place to put the railway initially, and so a spill in a railway line, and it's much easier for a train to have an accident and a derailment. They happen all the time, and so it seems to me pipelines would be a lot safer. However, there's a lot of opposition to pipelines as well. The old days, it's interesting, because helicopters used to be used to fly up and down the pipeline route, and they couldn't afford to do it more than once a week or once a month or whatever, and so the spill might be a week or a month old before the people would find it. But with drones now, you can have a drone running up and down that pipeline for way less money than a helicopter costs. And so the safety margins on pipelines, I guess there'll always be spills, but the trick is to catch them really quickly. The safety margins are much better than they used to be. And so it's unfortunate that people are fighting against pipelines when that would be much preferable than rail car transport.
The pro-pipeline people tell me, too, don't forget, this is modern technology with superior monitoring, superior materials compared to the old Kinder Morgan pipeline, which was built when Elvis first shook his hips. and a lot of people right now won't even know who Elvis is. I mean, they're that old. And he definitely would have had a couple of hips replaced by now. So they said it just makes sense to replace that pipeline to make it more efficient anyway.
I think that's right. I mean, I remember they used to, the spot welding thing, it's a completely different. Now they can x-ray all the welds. Before they just put it in the ground and hope that the welds were good, and now they can x-ray them all, and they know before they even turn the pipeline on that the integrity of all those welds is there, and then as time goes by, they can do preventative maintenance and check any issues before they actually turn into a huge leak. So to me, pipelines make a lot of sense, but it's not an area that I'm an expert in. But I just think that the expense of rail cars plus the safety issues of rail cars, it would be really nice to get away from rail transport. Although it's going to be hard on the railways because it's been a huge boost to their revenue lately as the volume of coal, which is their biggest product for rail systems in North America, as the amount of coal being shipped has dropped dramatically as the coal plants that are used to create electricity are gradually being shut down or quickly being shut down in some jurisdictions. The railway is really benefiting from this whole new product line. Really, crude oil by rail is pretty much a recent development, but it just doesn't, in the long run, seem to make a lot of sense.
We'll have more with Hilliard MacBeth right after this.
Glance Technologies owns and operates Glance Pay, a disruptive mobile payment technology now live in 16 cities in Canada and about to launch in the U.S. With revenues up 664% in the last quarter, Glance Technologies has the potential to be a worldwide leader in an industry projected to grow to $1.3 trillion in 3 years. Glance Technologies stock symbols are GLNFF in the U.S. and GET in Canada. Find out more at glancepay.com.
Keep informed. Receive our weekly recap of thought-provoking articles, podcasts, and radio delivered to your inbox for free. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage, HowStreet.com. Welcome back. We're talking with Hilliard MacBeth. Hilliard, off air, we were talking about if central banks are so good, how come their forecast numbers are so bad?
Well, I think the regulatory apparatus and the Bank of Canada, the central banks all over the world, and the economic theory that they're using, which is basically what they call a neoclassical theorems are flawed. And Queen Elizabeth famously said to the London School of Economics after the 2008 crisis, she asked them, how did nobody see this coming? And of course the answer was, well, we'd missed it. But the real answer, which they weren't willing to express, I don't think, was that the economic theories that they're using never were able to track the real world as it really happened. And one of the reasons is that economic theory, as it's being practiced in the academic halls and also at the central banks, and there's a very close connection between those two, does not allow for debt and banking and finance. It basically ignores all of that. It ignores the fact that people would be willing to go into debt at 29% annual interest rate if they desperately need that boat for the 3 or 4 weekends in the summer that they're going to go boating. No economic theory would postulate that people would be more interested in buying a house at $1 million than they were in buying a house at $500,000. And of course, the economic theory would never imagine that the bank would be willing to lend the money at $1 million. So they're trying to operate a system where they concentrate on GDP, unemployment, and interest rates, and they completely ignore the whole finance end of it. I shouldn't say completely ignore. They largely ignore the whole finance end of it. So when the Queen of the United Kingdom and the leader of the Commonwealth, including Australia and Canada, asked how did nobody see this coming, it's basically because they're looking in the wrong direction. So, and of course the regulators, because the banks are such big and powerful and successful organizations with billions of dollars of profit every year, the regulators don't feel in a position to question anything that the lending facility is doing. So the central bankers aren't questioning it, the regulators aren't questioning it. We all hope it works out, but in my mind, it doesn't make any sense to be lending, a young couple, 32 years old, with maybe $150,000, $200,000 combined income, $1 million to buy a house that, a mere 15 years ago was worth maybe a third or a quarter of what it's being sold for today. None of that makes any sense, but collectively, everybody's kind of gone along with it. You could call it a collective blindness to risk, and it's probably going to be the number one issue that we're going to be facing in Canada in the next couple of years is what do we do with this incredible risk level that's been built up in society? Not saying that anybody, there obviously are a few people that maybe didn't follow the rules, but basically almost all of this was done entirely within the rules as they exist, but it doesn't make any sense.
Hilliard, thank you so much for chatting with us. And by the way, thank you, Your Majesty, for asking such an intelligent question.
Yeah, too bad she didn't get an answer. That's the part that's scary.
The part. Thanks again, Hilliard.
Thanks, Jim.
My guest has been Hilliard MacBeth, author of the book When the Bubble Burst, Surviving the Canadian Real Estate Crash. He's also a portfolio manager and financial advisor in Edmonton. His website, macbethgroup.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio. Find us on Twitter at TalkDigitalNet. Our popular YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Questions for the show or our guests can be emailed to info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard. Thanks for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of HowStreet Media Incorporated.